Hello, friend. It's me, Pippin James Barr, Dr. Pippin James Barr, here to attempt something a little bit different with a new video where I want to introduce you to the basic principles of version control, as well as the basic workflow that we're going to use when we're programming, not just in this course or in the next course, but really a life skill that I want us all to build up and be really, really familiar with, which is how to write code, see what the code is doing, and use that code with version control to make sure that everything is happy for all eternity. Now, how are we going to do that? Let me begin. And let me begin by hiding. So, you will remember that in the previous video, we made this repository called cart253-2023. And on our computer, the repository just looks like a normal folder, as you can see here. You probably remember too that it was living in my documents folder inside a folder called GitHub, and then there it was. And it's also the case that if I go over to Chrome here, and I go to github.com, my username, /cart253-2023, the name of the repository, I can also see its, the way that it exists on github.com. And it's the same folder, it's got the same file in it, but there's a whole bunch of extra information involved in this. We also very briefly touched on GitHub Desktop while we were talking in the previous video. That's the application we can use on our computer. It's one of many, but this is the one we will focus on here. We can also use this to keep track of what we are doing in our repository folder and to keep it synchronized with GitHub online so that our files live safely in the cloud, wherever that is. We know where it is. It's a server farm with lots of huge computers in the desert. However, we haven't yet talked about how we're going to do our work in this repository, and we haven't really talked about how version control itself works. So just a quick overview. The point of version control, and we're using something that's called Git. This is a kind of version control software. GitHub is a website that supports Git and allows us to synchronize our work to the website. The point of version control, first and foremost, is to keep track of the work that you're doing on a project. So every time you do some work, we're going to be able to save that work inside the repository, and Git is going to enable us to have a whole history of all of the work that we've done on a project, piece by piece, as well as saving it onto the cloud via github.com. So it's a way of keeping track of the history of a project. One of the good things about this is that it also enables us to undo mistakes. So if we make some mistake, we're able to use our repository to kind of rewind time and go back to go back to better days when we hadn't made those mistakes. So there's a sort of sense of a big undo that's possible with Git. It's also the case that Git and things like GitHub can make it easier to work with other people because you can all share one repository folder and you can all do work inside of it, and Git will help to keep track of what everybody's doing and to make sure that all of the files are working nicely together. But more than anything, it's just this knowledge that something else is taking care of keeping track of what you've changed, right? So you don't have to make my cool project version 1, my cool project version 2, my cool project version 3, etc., which is something that we often find ourselves doing with files on our computers, right? Because we want to save in case we make horrible mistakes down the line. So we save multiple copies of files. Git means that we don't have to do that, okay? The other reason to learn this stuff, and one of the main reasons I include it in this course and make it mandatory, is that Git and version control in general are a huge part of getting a job if you're interested in working in a company as a programmer, but also as other kinds of digital work, whether you might be a 3D modeler, for example, or a sound engineer. A lot of these places are going to want you to understand how to use version control as a professional working in the industry. So there are lots of good reasons to use it. Let's actually see what it looks like and talk about what it means and what it does as we go. And what I'm also wanting to do at the same time is I'm wanting to talk a little tiny bit about how we're going to be writing code in our course. So the first thing that I want us to do, and I hope you'll follow along with me, do join me. The first thing I want to do is I want to go to the course homepage, which we can find at pipinbar.com/cart253. And I want us to get the template project that we'll be using throughout this course as a place that we can experiment, okay? And there are lots of different ways of getting it, but I think the easiest is we'll go to the schedule and we'll scroll down and you'll find, generally speaking, in all of the weeks, I've got a link to the template project here. So template P5 project. I'm going to download that by clicking on it. You can see I downloaded it 16 minutes ago as I was practicing. And that will end up on my desktop here as a zip file. And I'm going to go ahead and unzip it by double clicking on it on my Mac. And that will yield this folder. Now, this folder contains all of the information we need to make a fairly simple JavaScript project. And the first thing I want to suggest to you, and this is maybe the biggest thing to remember as you're getting started out here, is you should always be working inside your repository. So I actually want to make sure that the first thing we do is we move this folder inside our repository. And I'm going to do that by dragging it. And here's my repository here. You have your own ways, I'm sure, of getting one file or folder into another folder. I'm going to drop it into the repository here. So now in the cart253 repository, I've got my README from last time, and I've got this folder template P5 project. But this is not organized enough. Because what we're doing is we're working on a specific topic, or rather, we're kind of experimenting, right? So what I want to do is I'm going to make another folder, and I'm going to call it experiments. You don't have to call it this. I'm just trying to be organized. And I'm actually going to put the template P5 project into that folder just to be organized. So now my repository seems a little bit more organized to me. I've got the main folder, it's got a README, and then I've got this folder of experiments where I can kind of mess around with stuff and try things out. The final thing is, oh, look at that fancy move. The final thing I want to do is I want to rename the folder because template P5 project is not a great name. So I'm going to rename this folder to workflow. How about that? Workflow. Because what I'm talking about right now is workflow. So the great thing now is I've got my folder. We'll talk about what's inside the folder in a second. It's in my repository. Having added something to my repository, the very next thing I will want to do, and you'll end up doing this all the time if you're starting a new activity, you're starting a new exercise, you're starting a new project, you're always going to do this process, right? You're going to get the template project most likely. You're going to unzip it, you're going to copy the folder into an appropriate place in your repository, and you're going to rename the folder so that it reflects what it is, project 1 or exercise 10 or workflow in this particular case. So once you've done that, it's an important step. And in this moment, the thing that we want to do is go to GitHub Desktop and start learning about version control. Because what you can see here in GitHub Desktop is that by changing what was inside my repository folder, cart253-2023, GitHub Desktop has noticed that that has happened, right? So it says, oh, you've added all of these new files. You've added readme.md, you've added script.js, you've added these things. What are these? I don't know. Index.html, etc., etc. We can see these little green pluses. These green pluses are saying, you added this file to the repository. Thank you very much. I noticed. And what we can do then, and this is a key part of version control, is this is an important step. So what we want to do is make a record of having taken this step. And making a record of a step in your repository is called a commit. It's like taking a snapshot of all of the files at that exact moment in time. And one of the things that it requires is that you write a message describing what you did. So I might say, for example, here in this summary box down here, created a workflow experiment using the template. Maybe not created, maybe started a workflow experiment using the template. So that's describing exactly what this progress in my current project represents, right? I started something, I added some new files to my repository, I describe what it was that I did, and then I hit this nice blue button down here called commit to main. You probably remember that main was the name of the branch of our repository, you probably also remember that I don't think you'll be needing to worry about branches too much. So commit just means add this to the repository, add this to the history of things that has happened in this overall project of CART 253 2023. So I click on commit, bleep, and those changes go away because now they have been recorded. If we want to see what has been happening, we can go to this history tab here, history, and you can see the things that I've been doing, right? There was the initial commit that happened yesterday when I cloned the repository for the very first time. You probably remember that had that README document that had this inspiring description. This is my course repository for CART 253. But then we also see the next thing that happened in history, which flows upwards, is that we started a workflow experiment using the template. That's what we just did now. If we select it, we can see all of the files and things that were changed. So the repository, which currently is living on my computer in that CART 253 2023 folder, remembers the things that happened inside it historically, okay? This is a wonderful thing in terms of knowing what you've been doing. It's a wonderful thing for communicating with other people about what's been happening. The extra thing that we want to do, because we're using github.com, is we're going to do this button up here. We're going to do this button. We're going to press this button, actually, which says Push Origin. And this is the button that will tell it to synchronize with github.com. It will upload all of these changes so that they're reflected online. So I'm going to click that now. Click. It says pushing to origin. It says hang on. It doesn't take very long because these files are small. And now we have synchronized our repository with github.com, which is very, very important because it means if if my computer suddenly catches on fire or an alien comes and vaporizes it or something, all of my files are on github.com. If we head over there now and we reload this page, you can see that my workflow experiment folder is here now. All of the files that I added are in here, just like this. And similarly, on github.com, if we go back, we can see this message here. It says 2 commits. Those are the 2 stages in the history of my repository that exist right now. If I click on that, I can see the history, just as I could in GitHub Desktop, right? There was the initial commit, which was yesterday, and then there's this started a workflow experiment using the template, which is 2 minutes ago now. So it's all very precise. It's all very good at keeping a record of what you have done. That, my friend, is the basic process. But I want to take this a little further because I also want to talk a little bit about VS Code, and this will enable us to kind of repeat this progress, this kind of idea a couple of times. So dropping back to the Finder, to the files, we've got this folder called Workflow. And what I want to do now is I actually want to do some work in this project. We're going to do a bit of pretend programming. So what I want to do then is I need to run VS Code. You can run that in different ways. On a Mac, I like to use Command Spacebar, which opens Spotlight Search, and then I type code. And the first search hit for that is Visual Studio Code. You, of course, know how to open applications on a computer, so I have total faith. I will ignore this because that is the course repository. So there's a couple of things we can do here. But the most important thing is I want to open this project, which currently doesn't have anything terribly exciting in it, this workflow project. I want to open it inside VS Code because I want to edit it. You are going to be doing this constantly all the time. It's going to become second nature. But just this first time around, let's go about it systematically. So the thing that I would most likely do is I would grab the workflow folder here, workflow, and I would drop it onto Visual Studio Code like that. You will potentially run into, like I'm running into right now, some permission stuff. Do I want to give it access to my documents folder? Of course I do. Do I trust the authors of the files in this folder? Yes, I do. And then I will end up with the workflow folder open in VS Code. I can tell that I've done the right thing because I can see the name of the folder at the top here, and then I can see all of the different files and folders inside it listed down here on the left. If I wanted to, I could also open this folder by going here, File. So I could open VS Code, then I could go File, Open, and I could navigate this way, right? I could go to my home folder. I use a shortcut for that. It's Command-Shift-H on a Mac, and I could navigate to that same folder, right? Documents, GitHub, Car253 2023, and I could choose open here as well, right? That would do the exact same thing. It would open that folder inside VS Code. It's really important that you open the project folder, not an individual file, because you want to keep all of the files together because you're editing the whole project, right? You're not just editing a single file at any given moment. So now we've got our project open. We can look at the various files by clicking them on the left here. So that's the README. We will talk another time about writing a good README. For right now, let me actually replace this though. Experimenting with workflow. And I'm going to remove this. Checking out VS Code and using version control to write my programs. I feel cool right now. Full stop. And I can save that, right? Now, because I edited something, I also could go back to GitHub Desktop and it would have noticed that I had done that, right? You can see over here the changes thing has got a 1. It noticed that I edited the README inside experiments, workflow, README. And you can see it can tell what changes I made. The red means that I deleted something. The green means that I added something. And if I wanted to, I could commit this change as well to keep track of it, and I will. Generally speaking, it's a great idea if you make any sort of significant change, even a sort of not super significant change, you should commit it with a message. So I'm going to say, wrote the README for my workflow experiment. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to commit, and I'm going to push. That will again synchronize it with github.com so that this history of changes exists both here on my computer, initial commit, started experiment, wrote the README, and it exists on github.com, which we've seen before. That is the basic process, right? We're going to consistently be going, editing things here in VS Code, and then committing and pushing them in order to save them to our repository and get them onto GitHub. So this is the most important process, but currently all we've really been doing is editing a text file, right? So the final thing that I'd really like to take a look at is JavaScript. Now, we're not going to learn to program right now. That's the entire course. However, we can at least see what it looks like. So when we're editing our JavaScript, we're going to be editing this file called script.js. But just before I get there, actually, let me just have a quick profile of the other stuff in here. So we've got a folder called assets, this one here, and inside it, it's got a folder called images. Inside that, there's my favorite PNG, the clown emoji. And inside another folder called sounds, we've got a WAV file. Sounds like this. Turn it up a bit, I guess. Woof, woof. Those files are just there in case you need a placeholder for something. Just to demonstrate where things go. You're smart enough probably to know that images go into an image folder and sounds go into a sounds folder, but there's something there just to whet your appetite. So this folder is where we're going to keep all of the sorts of the pictures, the sounds, and potentially other things that we'll use in our projects. That's the assets. There's also a CSS folder with the basic style sheet for this project. Hopefully you are or are getting familiar with HTML and CSS. We don't really do a whole lot of fancy stuff with the CSS. We're not worrying about that. We're learning to program in JavaScript. We're not learning CSS right now. Always happy to talk CSS though, and commiserate. Then, as I said, well, we've got index.html. That's because when we're writing JavaScript, our programs are going to be running on a web page, okay? So that means that we need a web page. That means, also, I'm just noticing that I should really change the title of this web page to Workflow Experiment. There, that's a good thing to have done. And the HTML is including the various files that the web page needs to make it work. It's including the CSS here. It's including this thing called p5.min.js, which I'll talk about in a second. Also p5.sound.min.js. You might be able to guess this is something to do with getting sound working. And down here, it's also including this thing, script.js. It's in the JS folder, so we write js/script.js to tell index.html where it is, because index.html is here, so it would need to go to js and then script.js inside there. This is the file that we're going to be generally editing. Because we're using JavaScript, and because we're using this thing called P5 that mostly works on the canvas. A canvas is kind of a rectangle that you can draw stuff on in HTML. there isn't actually anything inside the body here, okay? There's just going to be a canvas that will be added automatically. We can talk more about all of these sorts of things if you're curious down the line. But the interesting thing is there's nothing inside body, right? Okay. Now, P5 is what is called a library, this thing here. It looks like total nonsense. The reason it looks like total nonsense is because it has this .min thing. This means minified. That means that it's really, really compressed JavaScript code. So it's essentially impossible to read. The fact of the matter is that even if it weren't minified and we were looking at it, it would still be pretty difficult to read because it's a complicated piece of programming. But what P5 lets us do is do all kinds of typical programming stuff, and especially visual programming stuff, fairly easily. It's a very nice learning environment for us. So this is what we're going to be using. We don't need to worry about this file. It's just there, okay? It's just inside this libraries folder. Same thing with the sound file. That's just there for us, and we'll use it when we need it. Okay? The file that we really care about is the script. Script.js is where we are going to write our own code. And again, we'll get into more of what all of these different things mean. For now, what I would like to do is just write a couple of lines of code to look at what the workflow is like when we're programming. So inside setup, and when I say inside setup, what I mean is inside these curly brackets after this word setup. Setup is a thing that's going to happen one time when my program actually starts running. And so anything I write in here is going to happen once at the beginning. And what I want to do is I'm going to add two commands in here, two instructions, okay? Create canvas. And here I'm going to specify the size of the rectangle that my program is going to be inside. I'm going to put it at 640 by 640. I like squares, okay? We will talk more about all of this weird stuff, all of these brackets and commas and semicolons later. For now, you can just copy this if you want to. What this is doing is defining how big my rectangle is going to be that I draw stuff inside, okay? It's called a canvas. The second thing I want to do is I want to make that rectangle have a color. So I'm going to use a command called background. And I'm going to specify the color using RGB values, red, green, blue. So I'm going to say that it's going to be 255 red, which is the maximum value for whatever reason. It goes from 0 to 255. Not for whatever reason. There's a reason, but let's not talk about it. 255 red, full red, 0 for the green, and 0 for the blue. That means that the outcome is going to be red, right? Because there's just one color being used here. And then I'm going to save my script. Okay? So we've done some programming. I may even have made some mistakes. Lord knows I make mistakes. But we have two instructions in here, just as if we were starting to work on our project, right? And maybe this is the moment where we're like, well, I would like to see this working. Now, you may recall that we enabled GitHub Pages yesterday, and that lets us turn our repository into a website online. So one way that we could view this, and I'll demo that at the end, is we could view this on github.com by committing and pushing this website that we're working on and viewing it online. But wonderfully, VS Code has this button down here called Go Live. And what Go Live will do is it will open this website that we're working on, this workflow folder, in a browser, and it will make it actually work. So I'm going to click that now. We're waiting. Oh, look at that. That is one red square. That is one 640 by 640 pixel red square. That is the canvas. You can see that it's centered on the screen. That's what the CSS is doing. But the great thing about this, right, is that if I switch back to VS Code, on a Mac, by the way, I switch applications by using Command and then Tab. We now know that these two instructions did this, right? And if I wanted to tweak them a little bit, maybe I think the square is just overwhelmingly large. Maybe I want to change these two numbers to 480, so it's a bit smaller. If I save this, which I'm about to do now, I will use Command S. Yes, you can save things by going out to File, Save, but that takes valuable seconds of your life. So I will use Command S, Control S on Windows. Command S, I save. If I go back to the browser now, the square is smaller. So the wonderful, extra wonderful thing about VS Code's Go Live thing is every time you save over here, we could make the canvas ridiculously small. Why don't we make it 48 by 48? Every time I save, I'm going to save now, save and switch back. Now it's very small. Every time we save, the thing that is in the browser is updated. So you get this great workflow of making changes and immediately being able to see the results of those changes in your browser. That's very powerful because you want as small a delay as possible to enable you to work creatively, to enable you to work quickly, and to get a sense of what's possible, right? So I'm going to set this back to 480 by 480. I think that's reasonable. So let's say that we're pretty happy with this. We've checked that it works over here, which is always a nice step. Now we're ready to, again, commit and push these changes because we have to think again about version control, right? We're working on our project, but we want to make sure that we're consistently sending our project into the repository, these snapshots, these commits of the project. So I head back to GitHub Desktop, and as you might imagine, it has noticed the changes, right? In this case, it's noticed a couple of changes. One of the changes that it noticed is that we have got the title. I added the title, right? So here's the title down here. It noticed that I added that and that I deleted this. It's seen a couple of other weird things that are kind of phantoms because I reformatted the document a little bit. This is really the main change, right? And similarly in the script, it notices that I added these 2 lines into setup, which created that red square that we were looking at. So that's a decent start on our project, right? So I might say something like started workflow experiment with a red 480 by 480 canvas. Now, one thing I will say is that it's possible that people might tell you not to write long commit messages. They might just tell you to say something like added canvas. Generally speaking, I think when you're learning to program, it's a better idea to write slightly more detailed messages here so that you're also kind of reinforcing the sense that you know what you're doing, right? I would generally prefer a longer commit message over a shorter one. When you're a pro and you're working in the industry and you're pulling down 500K a week, then maybe write your tiny little commit messages. For now, make them actually describe what you did. Okay, but this is the same idea, right? We're just doing the same thing that we were doing with the README. It's just now we're doing it with the code because the code is just another file full of text. So the thing that I changed was I started the workflow experiment with a red 480 by 480 canvas. I could mention that I added the title as well if I wanted to. I think that maybe that's too trivial. I commit, again, commit means that it saves the history on my computer. So now we've got these 4 different steps that have happened. And the push is the thing that will make it go onto github.com. So I push, and now it's synchronized with github.com as well. We can check again by going back here to github.com. If I reload this page, now we can see those 4 commits, which are the 4 sort of stages of this larger 253 project. And of course, these 3 commits here are all about my workflow experiment, right? And that really is it. So now we can happily make changes here. For instance, we might be curious about what happens if I change some of these values in here. I save, I go back, I take a look in the tab with my workflow experiment. Now it's a nice orange color. I have discovered orange through programming. And then if I think that that's really significant, I could write a commit message, changed the background color to orange. I could commit, and I could push. And now again, it goes up onto github.com, and we're keeping track of our work, and we're being good citizens of the programming universe. That is how our workflow works, okay? The final thing that I want to show you, and I'm just stalling for time a little bit because it can take a second to update, is that thing of viewing your website online, not just on your computer via the Go Live feature. But just to recap, right? Every time we start a project, generally speaking, we're going to have our folder that contains our HTML, CSS, and JavaScript and assets. Generally speaking, you can just download the template project and rename the folder to do that. We're going to make sure that we put it inside our repository. If you're like me, you're also going to make sure that it feels organized. So we've got repository. I have experiments here because this is an experiment. And then the folder with the project in it has a useful name like workflow. We work in there. So first thing we do is we get it into our repository. Then we open it in VS Code. I dragged it onto the application icon here, but as we discussed, you can also open it from the file menu with open. And then we may want to commit that initial starting of the project using GitHub Desktop. I think that that's a good idea. And then we go to work, right? We start the go live. We start go live with the button that was down here. We edit the code. We check what it looks like over here in the browser. We go back, we make more changes until we like what we see over here. We got the orange that we love. And then we commit and we push back over here in GitHub Desktop to kind of complete the circle. And that is how you have a nice software development workflow. Now, as I said, there was one more thing I wanted to take a quick look at, which is if we wanted to view this not on my computer, because this 127001 thing here means that this website is actually just running on my computer, it's not on the internet, there is a special URL that we can go to, which is your username. My one is pippenbar.com, that's my username. pippenbar.github, that's GitHub, .io, which is not .com, it is .io, / name of your repository, cart 253-2023, and then you want the path to the project that you're wanting to take a look at, right? So / I know that I put it inside experiments, / I know that the project is inside a folder called workflow. That is the address of the workflow experiment on the internet. So if I press enter, it may or may not show up because it may not be ready. Let's see. It was ready. So you may notice here that the pippenbar.github.io thing got replaced by my domain name, pippenbar.com. That's just because I run my personal website out of GitHub. Normally, when you do it, if you haven't done something like that, you'll see the usual yourusername.github.io, and that's totally fine and normal. So this, importantly, is a real website on the real internet. I could send it to my grandma and she could check it out. My grandma is unfortunately not alive right now, but I could send it to my parents and they could check it out and admire the orange that I have accomplished. There is so much more to learn, of course, but you now understand the very basic workflow of how to do software development with version control and VS Code. And I am excited for you because while there is a lot more to learn, we are only going to become more and more powerful. Please use your power for good. I will see you in the next video. Bye.